Okay, so full transparency here, I really like Shadow the Hedgehog. But that being said, I can't actually say that he was done all that well in Archie Sonic. I think that things got really good at the end, but I can't just say that he was done well because there was some bad in there as well. So, like examining a person's life, we've got to start with those awkward teens. And so with that, we're going to look at the good, the bad, and the weird of Shadow the Hedgehog and Archie. Now, Shadow technically made his first debut shortly after Mecha Sonic was let loose on Eggman, but he actually didn't really get up to much here. Heck, he had 0 speaking lines and all he did was destroy Mecha. Now, at the time here, the writer of Archie was Carl Bollers, and I don't think he really knew what to do with Shadow the Hedgehog. The main reason I think this is that Shadow wouldn't show up again until 8 issues later, and even then, I'm not joking, he has 0 speaking lines yet again. In fact, he gets even less time in this comic as it's merely just a recap as the president goes over everything that Sonic has done just up to date. So yeah, at some point it seems as though Sonic fought Shadow off panel, but Bollers wasn't going to show us that for whatever reason. Now, sometime after the events of SA2, or the closest thing that we would get in Archie, we would find ourselves in a story titled Sonic Adventure 2.5, and despite the title, it has almost nothing to do with SA2. Shadow would find himself in space with a UFO moving towards him, and another not far behind. We would then, since the first time Shadow was introduced 26 issues ago, get a quick recap as to who Shadow is. Shadow is created by Professor Gerald Robotnik, and he was made to be the ultimate weapon. Not for gun, but rather just for Station Square's government, which is kind of funny to me considering that, isn't Station Square just a city? Like, imagine one town getting the ultimate weapon. Like, okay guys, here's your one ultimate weapon. Not for the country, not for the government, just for you. As we know, Shadow would become friends with Gerald's niece Maria, and eventually Maria would get shot before Shadow was locked away in stasis. Then, our Eggman would find him after being chased by Mega Sonic and wake him up. Eventually, Shadow would end up working with Eggman, and so here we are, more or less to date. The events of SA2 presumably happened the same way that they did in the video games, with maybe some slight deviations here or there. But Shadow and Sonic ended up in space fighting the Bio Lizard, and ultimately, Sonic helped Shadow see good in the world. However, just like in the video game, Shadow would give his life for everyone, and he would plummet to Mobius, except it didn't quite happen that way in the comic books. Instead of plummeting towards Mobius from space, he would instead be saved by aliens. These aliens are known as the BEM, and they would heal up Shadow and get him ready to fight against another alien species who are the Xorda. And none of these have ever showed up in the video games, these are exclusive to Archie, so if you're a little bit lost and you haven't read the Archie Sonic comics, don't worry about it. The Xorda are this evil race that are planning on invading Mobius, and the BEM maybe put a little bit too much stock into Shadow being the ultimate life form, as Shadow just begins rushing towards the ship in his super form and thinks to himself about how he could just teleport into the ship and destroy everything. However, before he can even do anything, he just gets shot. He gets shot one time and that's it. Like, no joke, Shadow then just plummets towards Mobius and it's like, here we go again. And it's so funny to me because like there was so much buildup to ultimately nothing here. Like the BEM went to all of this effort just to effectively restart us at the exact same place we would have been if SA2 had happened. Anyways, Shadow would end up on Mobius, and after a bit of brief confusion where Shadow would punch Sonic, Shadow would then be pushed into the sidelines for the rest of the story, and it's really funny. Like I said, there's so much buildup around this guy, and then it's like, he doesn't say a single word. He just kind of looks confused in the background throughout the whole thing. It's very goofy. Now, during this whole Xorda invasion that I mentioned before, Shadow would be present, but yeah, just kind of confused in the background. He doesn't do anything of note, and like I said, this has nothing to do with SA2 at all. Funnily though, we actually would get to see something related to SA2, but literally years later into the future when Ian Flynn, the new head writer, would go ahead and create a sort of slight soft reboot to the story. We would learn that the events of SA2 mostly transpired the same way, except with significantly fewer characters. The cast would actually only be limited to Sonic, Shadow, and Rouge, who would all be forced to work together. And I actually really like this trio. I wish we got to see more of them together because surprisingly, they work really well for something that we've never really seen in the video games or really in the comics. Otherwise, story beats would go down pretty similarly, down to the spaceship in the pyramid in the desert, which is also such a strange thing. Like, let's just talk about that for a second. Why was there just this full-on NASA rocket in a pyramid in the desert? I know that it was Eggman who placed it there, but like, why? Anyways, eventually they would go up against the strangeness that is Shadow's big brother, the Bio Lizard. Now, with all of that out of the way, it seems like maybe the whole Xorda thing was just sort of bumped out of the place. Maybe it still happened, but the whole thing with the Bem reviving Shadow to go and fight just seems to have been kind of erased from history. Now, sometime later after the Xorda event, Eggman would send out his robotic daughter M to go deal with Sonic so that he could fire some missiles. However, this would be interrupted due to the fact that Shadow would show up and confront the Doctor. Shadow, being ridden like an absolute psychopath here, would inform Eggman that he wants him dead and that he is going to snap him like a twig and use him for kindling, which is so freaking insane. What the heck is going on here? He then goes on to talk about how Sonic has morals because he's a hero, but Shadow is not. And it's like, oh my god, they wrote like the edgiest character in the world. His dialogue is so goofy edgy. Feels like I'm reading something written by a child here. Seriously, I've seen people complain about Shadow being edgy in the video games or IDW or whatever, but like, they have no idea how bad things really were at one point. Now, continuing with bad dialogue, Eggman's other child, his son Adam, would go on to mess with Eggman's missile plans, which would prompt the funniest line from Shadow as he backhand slaps Eggman. And I'm gonna read it for you. "Daddy is going to be very sorry. Anyway." It's so silly, what the heck? Anyway, Eggman unsurprisingly manages to escape, and Bunny has this really cool moment where she destroys Eggman's ship, and Shadow goes back to being all broody by himself. This is also the last time that Carl Bollers would write Shadow, which is unfortunate, but also kind of fortunate. A part of me wants to see more of this over-the-top, edgy Shadow, but also I'd like to see what somebody else could do with him. And the next person on that list would be none other than Ken Penders. Our next story starts off with Shadow creeping up on a child. So not starting off so well. This child is Hope, and she's actually a distant relative to Maria, who, if we remember from that short flashback, was Shadow's friend. Seriously though, why does Archie have such a hard time explaining Shadow's backstory? Like, we never get to see any of it. Anyway, before getting to talk to Hope, Shadow would be confronted by a hooded figure who says that he needs Shadow's help. But Shadow, pretty understandably, isn't in the mood to help a random stranger who approached him and isn't even showing his face. So this hooded figure would then ensnare Shadow in some rope, and they would be teleported away. But Hope was watching as this happened, and she also got wrapped into this and teleported away. Shadow then gets tossed into a chamber, and oh my god, there's just more bad dialogue here. I need to share it with you because, like, who talks like this? "I'm in a chamber, but unlike any that's held me before. I'm not bathed in the warm, soothing nutrients that Professor Gerald had raised me in." Like, what is this? Who talks like this? Oh my god, I love it. Anyway, in a pretty fair moment, Shadow asks why he's been brought here, and it turns out that he's been kidnapped by someone in Knuckles' family. It's Knuckles' father, Locke. What? Because of course Penders needed to include a Knuckles relative into the mix. Locke continues with the weird dialogue by informing Shadow that as far as he can tell, Shadow is not biological, mineral, or vegetable, which is so funny to me. Presumably, Locke has spent time studying Shadow before they have met here, but we've never really seen it, and so I can just go on to speculate the fact that Locke looked at Shadow and was like, yeah, he's clearly not a rock or a vegetable, but is he biological? And it's like, who even classifies things as biological, mineral, or vegetable? Like, I understand to an extent classifying things that way, but like looking at a clearly alive being, you know it's not a rock. Anyway, Locke wants Shadow's help to find his family, but before he can really dive into what it's all about, Hope shows up and urges Locke to let Shadow go. This triggers some kind of PTSD reaction in Shadow, and he ends up bursting out of the chamber before laying the boots to Locke. After some fighting, Hope gets Shadow to stop, and she tells him that he's scaring her. Shadow then gets angry about the fact that Hope is not Maria, and he goes, "I must go now, my people need me," and just kind of jumps out of the ceiling and flies out of there, I guess. I don't totally know what's happening in this panel. Following Shadow's realization that his best friend is dead and that he's got no one in this world, Shadow would then contemplate on life while on the edge of the floating island before eventually jumping to the ground. Luckily, Shadow is some kind of super being because he doesn't just try to off himself here. In fact, Shadow was jumping due to the fact that he detected a signal similar to that of Professor Gerald. Shadow would discover a hidden base with a golden robot inside of it named Isaac, and though Isaac has a similar signal to that of Gerald, he claims to have been made by someone by the name of Professor Clark and another person who was Dr. Niven. After running some diagnostics, Shadow would learn that Isaac here was built over 10,000 years ago and was just never used. Shadow would then also encounter Sonic, who was here exploring the base with his friends, and neither of them would want to explain why they're here, and so naturally a fight just kind of breaks out here. And Shadow would actually come out pretty victorious, though not before being kicked in the crotch by Sonic. At least I'm pretty sure that's what's happening in this panel here. Also, like Bowlers, I don't think Ken had really any idea what to do with Shadow or what to make of Shadow. Shadow ends up described as just merely a sentient, which is silly because that describes literally everybody in this comic, but whatever. After Rotor finds Sonic, he makes it clear that Shadow is in no way related to Sonic, and he probably isn't even a Mobian, which is kind of interesting, and I do want to learn more about what Shadow is. However, to further complicate the situation, Eggman would spot Bunny flying above the space, and he would send Metal Sonic in to also fight everyone else who was here. Now, a little bit later inside of the space, Tails and Tommy Turtle would have a who's on first situation as Tails spots Shadow. Tails would announce that there are 2 shadows in the distance, but Tommy would see that there are clearly only 1 shadow and a robot, as there are not 2 creatures named Shadow there. It's honestly kind of funny. I wish we got more jokes like that. Shadow and Isaac would then run into Metal Sonic, and it's here we would learn that Shadow is registering as a biotic life form, meaning that he is part machine, part something else. A fight would then break out. Shadow and Isaac would turn their attention towards Sonic, and eventually everybody would fall inside of a pit trap. Now, to be completely honest here, I'm kind of disinterested in this whole next little bit, but to sum it up for you, we would learn that over 12,000 years ago, one of Robotnik's ancestors found the aforementioned Xorda and dissected one. This got the Xorda pretty angry, because of course it would. This ended up starting a war, and this war actually is the reason why humans no longer exist on the planet and why animals ended up evolving into the Mobians we know today. Personally, I've never been a really big fan of the whole idea that Mobius is just Earth in the future, but like whatever. During all of this world building, a chase after Sonic is on, and this would eventually lead to a giant missile. Another fight would break out, and Shadow would get to elbow Sonic in the groin before everything around them seemed to start to collapse. So it turns out that Isaac here has decided to turn on some anti-air turrets and is trying to fire against Sonic's parents who are here to come and rescue him. Shadow then has a change of heart and he decides that he's going to help Sonic escape, and in the end Sonic ends up hurting his ankle. So in this moment Shadow decides to be good and he hurls Sonic onto the ship, but in doing so he cannot escape before everything explodes at this base and he is engulfed inside of the flames. You might think this was a writer's attempt to kill off Shadow, but not even 10 issues later, Shadow would be back as he found himself running to a remote island base that had long since been abandoned by the government. Here, Shadow would find a video diary left by Professor Gerald, in which we would learn that Gerald has decided to seek revenge for Maria's death. Though this gets cut short as Shadow is then punched by Metal Sonic. During this brawl, Shadow would momentarily put on a Mega Man looking gun on his hand before just taking it off in the next panel, which is kind of weird. Like, what was the point in that? I guess to show that it's a gun, because Metal Sonic would then wear it as his own gun, and we would then learn that the video diary is still playing in the background. And so Gerald was ultimately executed because of how dangerous his projects had become. Anyway, Shadow throws a chunk of rubble at Metal just as Metal tries to shoot him, and this somehow causes a giant explosion and incapacitates both synthetic hedgehogs. They are then found by M, who then takes them to her father. This actually leads into a story that I covered in my Not So Super Supersonic video, but basically Eggman ends up gaining control over an army of Metal Sonics, whom he then sends out to destroy Knothole. Thankfully, Shadow would escape and rush over to help. It's here where we would get to see him use Chaos Control for the first time, and he utilizes it to take out all of these imposters. It's pretty fun. And with that, we've actually reached the last story written by Ken Penders, and I'm kind of glad it ended on a slightly higher note than Bowlers did, but things get significantly better after his departure, as I can pretty confidently say that we've made it out of his awkward teen years. Now written by Ian Flynn, Shadow would appear a while later on Sonic's birthday. Sonic would actually get jumped by Bean and Bark, and Shadow, as a birthday gift, would deal with Bean, which is honestly kind of funny. He's also really thankful for Sonic's help dealing with those metal variations and with the protection that he gave towards Hope. Now, while both of them smile and shake hands, things are pretty good, but he also explains that he's still going to work for Eggman from time to time and that he and Sonic are still enemies. It's honestly a kind of cute rivalry, and I really enjoy this dynamic. Speaking of Eggman though, shortly after this, Eggman would send Crocbot to attack Sonic, but with an upgrade as he is no longer just Crocbot, but now Croctabot. It's very silly. Then, to complicate things even further, Scourge, Sonic's other evil double, would show up alongside with Rouge. The one hedgehog and his two fakers would then go on to take out Crocbot together before getting into a fight with Sonic and Shadow going against Scourge. Eventually, Scourge would be forced to retreat, and he would run off into the forest where he would find a mysterious warp ring, and he would manage to teleport with Rouge, just narrowly avoiding being caught by Shadow. And that's probably the last we'll see of him, right? A while later, Shadow would receive a strange message from Eggman requesting his presence, only then to find out that Eggman had been taken hostage by his AI son Adam, who had then turned himself into some kind of metallic symbiote that took over the aforementioned Tommy Turtle that we saw in this video. That is a mouthful, and it's honestly a lot to cover. If you want to see the whole story, again, it's in that Not So Super Forms video. Try as he might, Shadow would eventually be defeated, and Tails would be kidnapped by Sonic's robot dad, who was temporarily unable to control himself. The two would be placed inside of chambers, and a large beacon would call forth all of the Chaos Emeralds in the universe. So just quick little aside here, but in the game version of Sonic, there are only 7 Chaos Emeralds, or 6 depending on which game you're playing. However, in the Archie universe, there are a seemingly unlimited supply throughout the entire galaxy. Adam would use Tails' turbo form to summon all of these emeralds, and then use Shadow's super form to use chaos control to help speed up its process. Eventually, the titular hedgehog would show up, and he would end up going into a fight against Adam that would lead to both of them going super in a really cool scene. However, this isn't a story about that, and so we're going to turn our attention back down to the ground. Eggman would rescue both Tails and Shadow, who would then combine their powers to unify all of the Chaos Emeralds into a special zone, and thus the 7 Chaos Emeralds were created as well as the special zone. Following this would be a really sad scene where Sonic's turtle friend would sacrifice himself, and Shadow just watches looking kind of pissed off. Like, seriously, why is he so angry here while standing next to a sobbing Tails? Like, comfort your friend here, man. Well, Shadow being pissed would actually just kind of continue, but for really good reason, as he would discover that Eggman actually has Professor Gerald's video diary, and he's been hiding it from Shadow. After not very much interrogation, Shadow would get the location of Eggman's diary after threatening Snively's hair, and I think it's really funny how devastated Snively ends up being after he loses his 6 strands of hair. Shadow would then find the diary disc hidden inside of a hollowed out book, because of course Eggman doesn't read, and then he would take it to the only people that he can trust with powerful enough technology to get this working. Rushing away from Eggman's bots, Sonic and Tails would come just narrowly in the nick of time to save Shadow, but just a moment too late, as there would be slight damage to the disc that was done by one of the bot's attacks. And in a really fascinating moment, although Shadow starts off angry, he doesn't lose it on Sonic. In fact, we actually see a little bit of growth in his character as he apologizes for being angry while explaining his predicament to the duo. He would look genuinely heart-wrenched as he explains this to them, and he would go on to beg Sonic for his help, as he desperately wants to find out and learn what he is. I've personally been on the edge of my seat ever since I found out that he is not a rock. With the help of the Freedom Force's AI Nicole, the gang would not only manage to see what was on the disc, but extrapolate from it and create an interactive environment that they can go inside of. Sonic and Shadow would then head in while Knuckles would keep watch on the outside. Inside, we would see a fractured past of Shadow's, and Shadow would look shocked as it appears he saw some kind of ghost, and in a way, he did. Shadow would be reunited with a virtual version of Maria, and he would explain to her the situation that he was in. She would then take Shadow to Gerald, and finally, Shadow would get the answers that he needed. Gerald would explain that Shadow was made to be a cure for Maria, who had the disease known as NIDS. It is this rare, uncurable illness on Mobius, and Gerald had made a deal with an alien by the name of Black Doom, who wanted Shadow to be an ultimate weapon, and that the Black Arms would come back for Shadow in 50 years. This would leave Shadow torn, unsure whether or not he is just a weapon or a cure. To this, Gerald would inform Shadow that Shadow is more than both of those things. Shadow is a savior who was created with love to protect the people of Mobius. But unfortunately, their time would be up, as the world around them would start to deteriorate as we would reach the end of this disc. Shadow would rush over to Maria, and on a final tearful goodbye, Maria would tell Shadow that he has to go on and protect everyone, and that she'll always be with him as long as he holds her in his heart. Honestly, it's so freaking moving. After escaping, Shadow would learn that Snively has been assaulting the base, and that Knuckles is losing ground. Shadow would rush over, and honestly, some of the best writing for Shadow that I have ever seen. He would exclaim that he is Shadow the Hedgehog, the union of ideals dark and benign, but ultimately built in the name of love. He's the ultimate life form, the protector of Mobius, and then he tells Snively to run back home and tell Eggman this, while throwing his 6 hairs into his face. It's just so good. Now, Shadow would reappear to try and save his world after Knuckles had been turned into an evil god, which is a whole story that I went into in my Interjack video. However, Knuckles Jack here would be way too much for even Shadow's mighty Chaos Blast, and unfortunately, Shadow would have to watch from the sidelines as Supersonic duked it out with Knuckles. So, I mean, so much for being Mobius's protector. Shadow would later reappear while Sonic was dealing with Scourge yet again. Shadow was trying to get his way into the special zone, and he wound up here on accident. Not only that, but Metal Sonic did as well. Now, because we didn't have enough Sonic lookalikes here, both Silver and Robo Hedge would then also appear, and an all-out brawl would break out. I really like this full art page. I've mentioned it before in other videos, but man, it's just so good, and I really want a poster of it. There's just so much fun going on here, but also it's really fun to see Silver in the background just looking so confused. Now keep in mind, at this point he had never actually met Sonic, and he has no idea who like the majority of these people are aside from Robo Hedge, so this is his introduction to everyone here. Silver would eventually hold them in stasis before clearing up some confusion. Eventually, everybody, including Metal Sonic, would put aside their differences and go and fight Scourge, which would then lead Scourge to going super in such a cool scene. Sadly though, we wouldn't get to see much more of Scourge, as Scourge would go on to beat everyone up, and Metal would turn his eyes back onto Sonic. So Shadow would take Metal and the two would Chaos Control out of there. Now, where to, you may ask? Well, Shadow would end up accidentally teleporting both he and Metal into the Sonic X universe. So Archie Sonic, for a while, was running this comic set in the Sonic X universe, and this is actually the first and only crossover that the two comics would have with each other. Here, Shadow would appear as Sonic was having a tea party with Cream, and to be honest, this issue is kind of boring, as Shadow and Sonic spend the majority of their time chasing down Metal so that Shadow can leave this universe. The best bit, however, is when they run into the Chaotix and Vector is all like, "Is that you, Shadow? Isn't he dead?" And that is a really good Vector impersonation, by the way. And Sonic's like, "Long story, he's better now." And it's honestly so funny to me, especially the Vector just accepts that answer with like, "Cool," and that's it. In the end, Shadow would once again find Metal, who had teamed up with this version of Eggman, but they would not be here long, as Shadow would once again use the power inside of Metal to teleport out of there. Shadow and Metal would then arrive in the middle of an ocean, and Shadow would try to reason with Metal that they are both living weapons and that they should be working together. However, this is not something that Metal is down for, and instead, Shadow gets kicked into the water. Fortunately though, Shadow is not Sonic and Shadow can actually swim. Doubly fortunate for Shadow is that he gets picked up by none other than Marine and Blaze, which mean that they're inside of Blaze's world. And I have to say, I absolutely adore the way that Marine is depicted here. She's so full of spunk, and I just love how dismissive Shadow is towards her and constantly gets her name wrong. I actually think the two would make a really fun pairing, and I wish we got more of them together. We would get a quick recap of what is essentially the plot of the Sonic Rush games before Marine's ship would arrive back home, and things would not be going well here as Metal was wreaking havoc while trying to find Eggman. Again, Shadow would try to extend the proverbial olive branch to Metal, only for him to be turned down once again as Metal explains that his function is to serve Eggman, and that despite the fact that they are both living weapons, he cannot go against that core programming. So naturally, a fight breaks out, and through a combination of efforts, Metal would get absolutely decimated as he would be lit on fire, hit with a spin dash, and then blown apart by a cannon. The cannon situation does leave Shadow with one small issue, as Shadow has been using Metal's engine to teleport through the multiverse, and without that, Shadow is now trapped here without a way home. This is also where that really funny meme image of Angry Shadow is from, as Marine just backs away. It's really good. God, there's so much good art in this. Luckily, Blaze happens to have a Chaos Emerald, which she gives to Shadow, as Shadow is a friend of Sonic's, and with that, Shadow can teleport back to Mobius. Once home, we would learn that Shadow is now working for Gunn and that he's been on a mission to try and find and explore this new special zone that he and Tails had created. Back on Mobius, Shadow would bust Sonic out of a trap and recruit him as he and Rouge went to go and take out a giant death beam, which Eggman had built inside of an old observatory. Unfortunately, while Rouge was trying to hack the system, a security system would be triggered, and so it was time for things to get physical. The three of them would end up flying up and destroy specific hinges of the laser, and Shadow would have a slight flashback to SA2 as he fell from the laser, only for this time Sonic to save him. With that, the day is saved, and Sonic is off on his own again. And then we get this really cute moment between Rouge and Shadow, as Rouge teases Shadow about how far along he's come with his relationship with Sonic, and that the two of them are now friends. We get a cute little smile from Shadow, and it's really fun to see a more humanized Shadow here. Now that we've talked about SA2, it's time to get a reference from SA1, and that's in the form of E101 Gamma. For those who don't know, Gamma was a robot created by Eggman who ended up going rogue. In the Archie universe, this guy has been on the run ever since he went rogue, and he has sporadically reappeared just in the nick of time to save Mobians from Eggman robots. However, he's never really helped out Gunn or the Freedom Fighters directly, and he's always worked as a free agent. Shadow would be sent out to locate Gamma as they have a rough idea of his last location, and it's up to Shadow to try and recruit Gamma to aid Gunn. Shadow would insist that he needs to do this mission alone, the reason for this being that he feels guilty that he wasn't able to save Metal Sonic, and he needs to prove that he can in fact save another living weapon and get him on his side. However, things aren't so simple, as Eggman has also constructed E123 Omega, who might be the ultimate killing machine. Out in the chilly tundra, Shadow would track down a reluctant Gamma who just wants to work alone. Shadow would then use this time to try and create a connection, as he explains that he used to feel that way as well, but he's begun to accept the help from others, and he explains that Gunn has given him a safe place to rest, information on missions, that he's been able to make an even bigger difference in the world than he could have alone. Reaching out with his hand, Shadow and Gamma then shake hands as they decide to join up. However, things would go sour really fast, as Gamma would then be attacked by Omega, who would use this opportunity to strike. Shadow would work to hold off Omega as he urges Gamma to get to the extraction point, But Shadow sadly was not prepared for the fact that Omega could take Shadow's spin dash and fire him off into the distance like a rocket. With Shadow out of the way, Omega would go on and hunt Gamma. We'd get this really fun moment where Omega would send out some messages telling Gamma to give up, as only a single shot of his could tear Gamma apart. Gamma can't get away from him and that he is outdated, with no abilities to beat Omega. However, we would learn that Gamma has downloaded info on Omega. Sure, Omega is strong, but he's also heavy and loud. He may be a walking arsenal, but Gamma is an assassin, and he manages to fire on Omega, knocking him down, and honestly, God, that moment just gave me shivers. Gamma would admit that he is out of date, but that it would be impossible to completely destroy him, as you could never destroy his soul. Now, Omega then releases a comical amount of weapons. He explains that robots don't have souls, but Gamma would be determined to show his brother otherwise. Omega would open fire on Gamma just as Gamma finished uploading something to Omega. After a barrage of bullets and missiles, Gamma was no more. Well, the robot was no more. But we would see a cheerful Flicky fly free. Shadow would be ready to attack Omega as he caught back up, but would then learn that Gamma had managed to upload his coding that he had developed when he got his own free will and sent it to Omega. As the two codes merged, Omega would gain Gamma's soul as one final parting gift from his brother. With that, Gamma starts to gain deeper thoughts and accepts to join Shadow in order to take down Eggman and get revenge, creating him as something only meant to destroy. So remember all that talk about the special zone? Well, now we finally get to see it, and it's really fun how they've used it in the comic books. Essentially, they've taken the special stages from the video games and incorporated them in this really unique way, where there's an evil godlike being known as Feist who sets up rules and challenges to acquire Chaos Emeralds. While Shadow and Rouge would struggle to do these on their own, Feist would not be prepared for Omega. As Shadow and Rouge would work on collecting the emerald, Omega would reveal that Plan B to Feist is just firing everything he's got upon this god. And honestly, I just really love it. As Feist is being shot upon, both Shadow and Rouge manage to collect the Chaos Emerald from him, and then Shadow teleports them out of there, leaving them victorious with a Chaos Emerald for gun. Alright, I covered this next part pretty heavily in my video on Rouge the Bat, so we're going to try to skip through it pretty quickly, but essentially Rouge would show up in a story involving Blaze and her soul emeralds, which is kind of fun. Amy, Cream, and Nicole would also be here, and although Amy is pretty reluctant to have Rouge join them, Rouge eventually joins up as Blaze is pretty okay with having more help trying to find this emerald to save her world. Eventually, Rouge goes to explore inside of a crevasse, and while inside of there, she finds the soul emerald. However, after getting the soul emerald, it is then revealed that, unsurprisingly, Rouge is here to steal it, and she's not planning on giving it to Blaze, and a fight breaks out. At this moment, Omega and Shadow then also appear to back her up. The fight is actually pretty intense, with Omega reminding us yet again that he is the perfect machine of destruction. Like, seriously, what a comical amount of guns this guy has in him. I love it. Then, after getting his bell rung by Blaze, Omega goes all lovey-dovey against her, and he's like, I like you, let's burn things together, much to Blaze's shock, and I just love the guy. He's so funny. Now, the soul emerald may as well be made out of butter because, man, it slips through everybody's hands, but eventually it would end up in Shadow's hands. Shadow would attempt to use it to chaos control out of there. However, it wouldn't work, as this isn't a chaos emerald, and it's a soul emerald that is controlled by Blaze, so instead just makes a big fiery explosion that does not go well for Shadow. Now, while all of this fight is going on, Bean, Bark, and Knack the Weasel would show up, and they would end up using this opportunity to steal the soul emerald right under everybody's noses while they aren't watching. After realizing that the emerald has been stolen, the group decides to reluctantly team up, and then they're off to go and hunt down these capers. What's really fun here is we get this really adorable panel of Omega and Cream sharing the sidecar. We also get to see that Shadow does in fact have his motorcycle from the video game. I love seeing stuff from the video game incorporated into the comic books. We also learn that Shadow purposefully chose this motorcycle. He takes care of it regularly and he loves it, and despite the fact that he's able to outrun it, he rides it regularly. Eventually the group would catch up to the group who had stolen their soul emerald, and to complicate things even further, the Babylon rogues also show up because of course we just need more enemies here. During this fight, Rouge would end up formulating a plan with Amy, and I really love when the two of them work together. It shows them as really competent leaders and not just followers, which is pretty great. The plan, however, is pretty simple, as Blaze just ends up igniting Beam's bomb, causing everybody to blow up in a cartoonish scene. Now, while they had won, you would think there would be another fight that would break out here, but Shadow says that he is going to let Blaze take the soul emerald. Essentially, this is for two main reasons. The first one is that really there's no reason that Gunn should be taking an emerald from Blaze when this emerald could be saving Blaze's world, and also due to the fact that there is a portion of Shadow that owes Blaze a favor because she gave him a Chaos Emerald. Now, Shadow and his team would have to be put on pause for a second as the universe would end up getting really shooken up as Sonic and Mega Man's worlds would combine. Briefly, Shadow would find himself as a robot master, but eventually things would be retconned back to normal with some very slight minor changes that we don't actually have to talk much about in this issue. The biggest thing here that has happened is that Hope no longer exists, but by and large everything's more or less the same with Shadow still working with Gun. For the most part, Shadow would end up taking a backseat in the main comics and he would really only appear with Rouge and Omega as they watched a fighting match on TV. Low-key, I actually really love this panel. It makes me wish that we got more slice of life Team Dark stuff. Team Dark's first mission together following the Super Genesis wave would be a team up with a gun troop known as Spider Troop. We would learn that there is a comet en route with Mobius and that it is full of Dark Arms aliens, and let me tell you, I am so here for it. I think I'm one of the dozen people who actually really enjoy the Shadow game, but if you're not one of the 11 other people like me, I'll explain to you really quickly what the Dark Arms are. The Dark Arms are the main baddies from the Shadow the Hedgehog video game, and they were briefly touched upon when we saw Black Doom way back earlier in this video. So Team Dark and Spider Troop are sent to go and destroy the new Dark Arms comet, and with a nuclear device that they need to set up inside of the core of the comet. The group would infiltrate the comic, and man, I just love it so much. The art throughout the entire arc here is honestly really top tier, and it's just so beautiful seeing all of these characters. After the first wave of Dark Arms is defeated, the nuke would be unloaded into the comet, and they would continue to push further inside of it. While pushing through this comet, Shadow would feel a psychic presence which he would then use to lead his group through the comet. Shadow would then make the questionable choice of going up ahead alone, as his unique physiology allows him to use the Dark Arms conduits. Alone, Shadow would then have to face off against an army of Black Arms aliens that he would actually manage to deal with pretty effortlessly on his own. But then we would be introduced to yet another living weapon, and this is a creature known as Eclipse the Darkling, and he's essentially what Shadow would have been had he had been born pure Dark Arms. Shadow would face off against its half-brother, and interestingly, we learned that due to Eclipse's link to the comet, he's been able to somehow nullify Shadow's chaos control ability in here, and while placing his hand on Shadow's head, he's able to send messages directly into Shadow's mind. We would learn that after Black Doom's defeat in the Archie version of the Shadow game, a second hive mind was awakened and given all of the memories of Black Doom. This creature was known as Black Death, and I'm going to be 100% real here. Black Death is such a cool character in both name and design, and I think he was considerably better than Black Doom. Black Death, using the knowledge of Shadow, would then construct Eclipse as the perfect counter to Shadow. Shadow would regain control over himself, but just for a brief moment, as Black Death would then emerge and he would manage to enslave Shadow, as he took over his mind and brought him in as the vanguard of the Dark Arms. We would then learn that Eclipse is unique from the other Dark Arms creations, as he can think for himself and can actually work without the hive mind, which has led to Shadow's capture instead of his destruction. To both Rouge and Omega's shock, they would have to face off against their fantasy-led army full of aliens. While Shadow would be hard to defeat and Eclipse would be an absolute menace for Spider Troop, Rouge would manage to break through to Shadow and they would get him to attack Death's Eye, revealing it to everyone and allowing Omega to open fire on it in what I am 99% sure is a reference to the orcs from 40k, as when he fires it makes the daka daka sound, which is what the orcs call their guns. With the eye destroyed, Shadow is then freed from its control and Team Dark would head out on one final assault. Shadow would go for Black Death while Rouge and Omega assisted Scorpion Troop in regaining some ground and setting up the nuke. Shadow, in a really intense moment, would face off against Black Death, and we'd know things would get really serious when he takes off his inhibitor rings with nothing holding him back. Shadow would then destroy Black Death with the power of Chaos Blast, and without their hive mind, the Black Arms would be destroyed. Well, almost all of them, as in his final moments, Black Death would use one of his eyes to actually rescue Eclipse and send him to Mobius inside of a shuttle. It's actually kind of sad to watch Death's Eye die in Eclipse's lap. In the nick of time, Shadow would have to run out of the comet as their shuttle flew away, and after the explosion went off, just mere seconds later, Shadow would teleport aboard the ship, cutting it just oh so close in a really fun action scene. Team Dark would arrive on Angel Island, as Intel would point to the fact that Eclipse has likely crashed here. Additionally, Snively, who at the time was working for Gun, would really want Team Dark to steal the Master Emerald for Gun, which historically seems like a really bad idea, as like, doesn't that thing keep the island afloat? But anyways, the group would then be off, and after a good deal of references to other video games, Team Dark would make it to Knuckles, who is accompanied by newcomers Relic the Archaeologist and her robot Fix-It. Here, Shadow would see that Relic has found some kind of strange plant growing on the island, and after looking at some clippings of it, it turns to the idea that Eclipse is very likely here and trying to terraform the island. The group would then split up, with Shadow and Relic remaining with Master Emerald and the others searching for Eclipse's ship. Shortly after his friend's departure, Shadow would get a terrifying sight as Relic would transform into some kind of insectoid hybrid, and Black Death would appear on Snively's monitor. This, of course, would all be mind games from Eclipse, and I wish we really got to see more of his link with Shadow, but Shadow ended up convincing Eclipse to come out, and a fight would commence. Eclipse would use his power to Hulk out, and he would make himself nearly indestructible. And he would probably be indestructible if not for the fact that the Master Emerald was right here. Harnessing the power of the Master Emerald, Shadow would freeze time and then just decimate Eclipse with a Chaos Blast, to the point where, when time resumed, Eclipse's muscular frame would just fall off of him as he went flying off into the distance, getting a taste for how powerful this emerald is. While Shadow did win, he would be in very rough shape, and Relic would have to call back to the team to come and support Shadow. Once the group returned, Shadow would try and go out and fight Eclipse, but he would be stopped by Rouge, due to the fact that Rouge thinks that he is far too injured to continue. We would learn that Knuckles and company have actually found Eclipse's shuttle, and the thing is destroyed beyond repair, so there isn't really anywhere that Eclipse can go off this island. Still, Shadow worries about Eclipse, and really doesn't want him to get his hands on the Master Emerald, so he reasons that the only logical thing to do is that Gun needs to take the emerald somewhere where it can be protected. And unsurprisingly, this starts a conflict. Both Shadow and Knuckles would start fighting, and honestly, Knuckles would hold himself off really well against what is supposedly the ultimate life form. Though we do need to remember that Archie Knuckles is basically Archie Jesus. Shadow, after attempting to use Chaos Control to get himself closer to the emerald, would then be thrown away by Knuckles, making this the second time that Shadow has been launched away in this video. Shadow would have to deal with his own fears as manifestations of Eclipse would appear in his mind and taunt him of what he'll do to Shadow's world. Shadow and Knuckles would continue to fight quite far away from the Master Emerald until the two of them would ultimately fall inside of a lake. Once out of the water, Shadow and Knuckles would get ready to continue sparring until Knuckles suddenly detected the Master Emerald had been displaced. Shadow would then radio in only to find out that Eclipse had attacked and stolen the Master Emerald. He's now off on his way to commandeer Team Dark's shuttle and escape out of here with the Master Emerald. So Shadow and Knuckles would have to team up and rush over together to go and stop Eclipse from doing this. Once there, Shadow and Knuckles would face off against an even more powerful version of Eclipse thanks to the addition of his corrupted wisps. Now there's a shameless plug right here. If you want to learn more about all of this in Eclipse, I have a video specifically on Eclipse that you can go watch. Now, while Eclipse was really strong, he did get pushed to his limits, and it was during this brief pause here that Knuckles would have a second to reflect on himself. And he would realize that the only real way to protect his emerald from both Eclipse and Gun would be to destroy it. So once again, Knuckles destroys his emerald, and Eclipse manages to, for a brief moment, escape, as he uses one of his wisps to then blast Shadow and Knuckles, and he steals the shuttle and gets out of here. This actually, unfortunately, would end Eclipse's saga. I'm sorry if you wanted more of him. The plot revolving around the Master Emerald would continue as Team Dark would start to hunt for these shards, and they would eventually cross paths with Knuckles and Amy, which means it's time for another team up. Things would get pretty tense though, as Shadow and Knuckles really aren't on super great footing since their last meeting, but they reluctantly put that aside for the greater good. It also helps that Team Dark already has 3 shards, which they are willing to give to Knuckles. With King Max's permission, the group then heads off to the Mystic Cave Zone, and to Rouge's joy, they would find what appears to be the Master Emerald inside of it. However, as it turns out, this is actually a fake emerald, which is all the better for Rouge, as it means that she can take it all for herself. The gang would then continue to make the classic mistake that they have done throughout this video, where they decide to once again split up. Historically, this has not worked out for them, but maybe this time. Together, Shadow and Knuckles would head out, and while exploring, to their shock, they would be introduced to Nixus. He's a new echidna that we've never met before, and he's also been working on rebuilding the Master Emerald. Now, post-Super Genesis Wave, this actually wouldn't be all that weird, as there were more echidnas than any other species, and heck, Nixus would probably even be related to Knuckles. But in this new timeline, Knuckles is the last of his kind, and so it's actually pretty shocking to see him. However, they wouldn't really get much time to talk, as Rouge and Amy would find themselves under siege by Omega, who's been taken over by some strange crystals. And yeah, I'm sure some people have already figured this out long before, but let's save the surprise for those who haven't. Shadow would head off to go and help against evil Omega, while Knuckles would follow Nixus to reconstruct the Master Emerald inside the cave system. With some effort, the gang would manage to slow down Omega but not destroy him. The group would have to figure out something fast to save their friend, as they really don't want to kill him. So they would run back into the main system, and it's here where they would catch up with Knuckles, who would have some rather shocking news to share. However, before he can get to that, they would have to deal with Omega. Omega would be a huge threat to deal with, as he could seemingly shrug off any attack that came his way. But eventually, after a long sequence of attacks from his friends, Omega would be rescued as the crystals holding him would be destroyed. We would also get this really funny moment where Amy tells him that he would have done the same for any of his friends, to which Omega just goes negative, which is really funny. Following this, the group would be led by Knuckles to where Nixus has gathered all of the Master Emerald shards, and shocker, Nixus is actually Ixis Nagus, or rather Walter Nagus as he's known now. He's this evil wizard, by the way, if you didn't know who he was, and has been a longtime villain in the Sonic universe. He's assembled all of the shards, and he's planning on using the power of the Master Emerald to make himself unstoppable. Not only that, but he actually looks really cool in this comic, which I thought was impossible for Nagus. Nagus would manage to freeze everyone inside of crystals, and for a moment it would appear as though he had won. However, the crystals have one big old flaw, and that's that they are not punch-proof. So Knuckles manages to escape thanks to the power of the Master Emerald. He also manages to save his friends, and so the hunt is on for the Master Emerald. Nagas pulls off a mimic and briefly turns himself into Sonic, but Shadow and Knuckles don't have any problem beating up on their friend, even if Amy wouldn't do it. And finally, Team Dark lay the boots to Nagas in what is just honestly some really fun combat panels. As Amy and Knuckles retrieve the Master Emerald, they are then teleported to Sky Sanctuary Zone, and during this time, Team Dark manages to defeat Nagas once and for all. The Master Emerald is then returned to its resting place, and that's actually the end. Not just the end of this arc or the video, but the end of Archie Sonic's Team Dark completely. This would be the last story they were ever featured in before the cancellation of Archie Sonic, and so we've actually covered everything that Shadow has done in Archie. This was a really interesting video to make, and honestly, it easily doubled in length from what I thought it was going to be. I don't typically like to mention authors as I'm writing my videos, but I felt it was really important to do so as to really illustrate Shadow's transformation throughout the comic, because while I have done similar deep dives, such as my video on Bunny Rabbit, I feel as though Bunny's character changed a good deal compared to her first issue, but it felt like character growth. It felt as though she was changing and evolving as the comic went on. Now, whether or not that was deliberate is up to your own interpretation. However, Shadow, for a good deal of his run, at least in his early appearances, struggled to find a place within Archie, and I think that was in large part due to the fact that the writers didn't really know what to do with him. Now, this was perhaps due to unfamiliarity with the material that he was from, or just due to the fact that they felt that his specific character and powers didn't fit into the world that they had created, but he didn't fit. Now, of course, this is all speculation on my part, but for a really long time, this guy felt out of place, and it seemed like he shouldn't be in Archie, which is a real shame because Shadow is a really great character, and under a proper writer like Ian Flynn, we got to see how this guy could be turned around and utilized in really great ways that made him feel like he was an Archie character. Anyways, that there is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed, and you can see why I enjoy Shadow inside of the Archie comics, but also see why he wasn't always so great. This is going to be by far my longest comic video I've ever made, and while it might seem like I'm just talking about comics for a really long time, these videos do take a lot of work for both myself and my editor to get through. If you feel like this video has earned any kind of like, comment, or subscribe, it would really mean a lot, but as always, I'm not your boss and I can't tell you what to do.